Aleph Amud Beis 11b. We're in the middle of a discussion about the Jewish slavery in Egypt. And the Gemara is going through the verses describing the beginning stages of that slavery and analyzing each word one by one. And the last comment we had, which is going to be important as we go forward, and actually the Gemara forward is going to substantiate something we said yesterday. So the last discussion we had was this word befarach. And the verse reads in its entirety, Vayavidu Mitzrayim es bnei Yisrael befarach. It's Shmois, Exodus chapter 1, verse 13. And the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people or made them work befarach, with farach. What is farach? Which means it's something to do with servitude, but exactly what? So the Gemara gives two interpretations. One is farach is a breakdown of two words. Exodus 1:13. Vayavidu Mitzrayim es bnei Yisrael, and the Egyptians enslaved the Jews befarach, with farach. So two different interpretations to the word befarach. One was that the word befarach is a combination of two words, perach, soft tongue, and that they coaxed them into, it was a slow boiling pot that got the frog, slowly telling them, no, it's okay, it's no big deal, getting them accustomed, getting them acquainted, and then it's too late. One way. Well, the other way of understanding befarach comes from the word fricha, which means like shiver and guf, means like to completely oppress them, completely just strong arm them. So two versions, soft and then strong arm. And I said yesterday that it's not necessarily a dispute as to what happened, meaning they both could agree that it started off soft and then got more difficult. It's just a question of what does that word mean, right? They could both agree on what happened, but they're just arguing as to what that word befarach means. And I think we're going to see now something which is going to substantiate what we just said. Okay, so this is where we are.
They fell into a trap.
Yeah.
But Hashem created that trap.
Hashem knew that, right? Hashem promised Avram already that this was going to happen. Okay. So now the Gemara comments, second line from the top of the page, third to last word right in the middle, but there's a little aleph there, a little one, depending on what kind of Gemara you have. So the next verse reads, Vayimaru es chayayim. Is it the very next verse? Let's have a look. Yep, it's the next verse, chapter 1, verse 14. Vayimaru es chayayim, and they embittered their lives. The Egyptians embittered the lives of the Jewish people. The root word of vayimaru, and they embittered them, coming from the word maror, bitter. Thus we eat the maror on Pesach. So vayimaru es chayayim, and they embittered their lives. Ba'avoda kasha, with difficult work. B'chaymer ulevenim, with bricks and mortar. Or actually, two types of mortar, chaymer ulevenim. And then the verse goes on, ubechol avoda b'sada, and all work in the field. So that's what the verse says. Embittered their lives with difficult work, with bricks and mortar, and then with all work in the field. So says the Gemara, Amar Rava said that this verse is very specific in its order. It first says, B'chaymer ulevenim, made them work with bricks and mortar, ulbasayif, and then only later, B'chol avoda b'sada, and all work in the field. So it's progression. First building buildings and then making them work in the field. Why is working in the field worse than building buildings? I'm not sure. Why is this the progression? I'm not sure either. But that is what the Gemara says here.
Working in the field is hard.
I don't know. Ask him.
That's what it's saying.
It seems like it's I don't know. The Gemara doesn't say what the progression is, but it says that it is a progression. They started off doing bricks and mortars and then going to all the work in the field.
They had to gather the straw.
That came later. Gathering the straw came later.
That's progression now.
But that's a verse later after Moshe Rabbeinu. All the verse we're reading now is all the verses we're describing now is before Moshe Rabbeinu comes on the scene as leader, as redeemer. So it's before any of that, and that only comes later when Moshe Rabbeinu tries to convince Pharaoh to say no. Right. Pharaoh makes it worse, but this is before that. It's describing the progression into slavery, but somehow it started off with building and then into work in the field. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe the building is like those storehouses, so it's easier to convince them that it's necessary to do that because we need storehouses like your father, like Yosef did, and then later convince them to do other work. Maybe that's the progression here. But the Gemara makes a point of this progression.
They ease them into it.
Right, but I'm just wondering why the progression is going from, sorry?
Like a shoehorn.
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out what the progression is going from working with bricks and mortar and then going to the field. Like why is one worse than the other? I don't know. I'm just saying. I'm not sure. But that's the Gemara says the progression
Working
is.
in a field is difficult work.
So is working in a building difficult work. Right. I could be just because it could. I'm suggesting maybe that the building of the building was something that the Jews first understood. We're building storehouses just like Joseph did because we need to preserve for rainy fund, rainy day, rainy fund, rainy day fund, whatever you call it. And then now they're stuck in working, so they're making do all work in the field, just even in unnecessary stuff because we have you already. Maybe that's what's. Sorry.
Does it ever rain?
In Egypt?
No, in general. We're always saving for a rainy day.
Oh,
right?
does it ever rain?
Does it ever rain?
Rain's blessings. Right? Okay.
No, rain is blessings. So
Yeah.
I'm saying, does it ever rain? We're always saving.
Yeah, I know.
Does it ever rain?
Anyway, okay. So I was saying it rains blessings. Okay, the verse concludes. The same verse concludes. So it's chapter 1, verse 14. So the verse reads, they build their lives, avoid the caution with difficult work, with bricks and mortar, and all the work in the field. Okay, so they progressed from working in buildings to working in the field. And then the verse concludes, all of their work, which they enslaved them, the farach, again using this word befarach. So now the Gemara says, all of the work that they did, befarach. Now, Shmuel said, what is all of their work? What does this mean? What is the hard work? Right? It says they made them work with all the work in the field. All of their work, which they did in the field. Okay, Rashi is a different version of the Gemara here. Where the Gemara is now commenting on when it said earlier in the verse, they embittered their lives, but for the kasha with difficult work. So what does the word difficult work mean? That's how Rashi's version of the Gemara goes, which is a bit different than the version of the Gemara we have here. Okay, so let's just make it clear. They embittered their lives with hard work in the field. They embittered their lives with hard work, with bricks and mortar, and all the work in the field. So we already commented that bricks and mortar comes first, and then it progresses into all the work in the field. Now, in Rashi's version, the Gemara is backing up to explain the words before, which says hard work. What exactly is this hard work? So it says Rabbi Shmuel something that's not something you would think intuitively. Intuitively, you would think hard work is backbreaking labor. That says Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, a more psychological difficulty. They would make the men do the women's work, and the men do the women's work. Sorry, they make the women do the men's work, and the men do the women's work.
I like doing dishes.
And that is a psychological difficulty. Making the dad stay home to deal with the kids all day, making the women work hard in the field. Doesn't say exactly what, but the point is that it was a psychological game in making them work, which that was making them work and do jobs that they were not equipped. Making them, we're going to learn something about their pregnancy in a minute, but they would make them do work that they were not accustomed to. So the difficulty wasn't only in that it was difficult, physically laborious, but psychologically difficult because they were making them work in things that they didn't. Now, if the progression is still of importance here, and this comment comes before the comment before of Rava about bricks and mortar, and then followed by doing all the work in the field, right? Because the verse says first difficult work, and that's what Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani comments and says it was difficult psychologically, and then the verse says bricks and mortar, and then the verse says all the work in the field. So the progression would go mess with their psyche, then make them do work in buildings, and then make them work in the field. So it would be like the first attack would be like a psychological warfare to mess with their schedules, mess with their routines, mess with their minds, and then disorient them exactly, making the men do the women's work, the women do the men's work, and this guy do that guy's job, and everybody's all submission, nobody knows where they stand, and then strike. That's what it would seem like. Okay, the Gemara continues now. Now, the opinion which said yesterday that verse 11, right? It's chapter 1, verse 11 of Shemais. Sorry, verse 13. The one who said that verse 13, which says that the Egyptians made Jews do work, befarach. And yesterday, one of the translations was beferach, with a soft tongue, soft mouth, that they first coaxed them into it. But today, in verse 12, in verse 14, the next verse, could not mean soft tongue. It has to be difficult work. Because at this point, we're already describing the fact that they were embittered. Right? There's two verses describing the slavery. First says that they made them work befarach, and then it says they embittered their lives with hard work, and then they made them work bricks and mortar, and then in the field, and this was all befarach. So in this context, in this next verse, the word befarach could not mean soft tongue, because it's already too late now. So even if you were to describe yesterday's befarach in verse 13 to mean soft mouth, today it definitely means harsh labor.
Is that because the progression is not?
Because at this point, we're already after the progression of hard work.
We're already after the progression, so.
That's right.
So it can't mean slow.
That's right. So that's why it further supports what I was saying yesterday, that I don't think the two people are arguing as to what happened. Everybody agrees there's a progression. It's just a question of what that word befarach in verse 13 meant. Did it mean the concluding point that was very difficult? And then the next verse describes the progression. First hard labor, psychological, and then work in the building, and then work in the field. But the earlier verse, when it says befarach, is just describing the conclusion that it was difficult. Or is the verse describing what first happened? Beferach, or is a soft tongue that slowly coaxed them in. And then the next verse concludes befarach, meaning hard labor.
It mean both in context?
Could be both. But in other words, let's just read the two verses in the way it would flow according to both views. If my reading is correct, they're not arguing about what happened, but they're just arguing about what the verse means. You know what I mean? Like this. So,
Brilliance of Hashem.
yeah. So I'm just going to look at the Chumash right here. I'm looking at the verse right here. So we're looking at verse 13 and 14. Okay. So the Egyptians enslaved the children. This is verse 13. So the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with farach, this word. And then the next verse says, and they embittered their lives with hard labor. That was psychological warfare. And with clay and with bricks, stage 2. And with all kinds of labor in the field, stage 3. And all the work that they worked with them with farach. So you have twice this word farach. One that says like an introductory line, and the Egyptians made the Jews work befarach. And then the next line, which says the specific 3 items, difficult work, psychological, and then bricks and mortar, and then field, and then again, 1 second, and then it says befarach again. So twice you have this word befarach. Once in the chapter 13, which is a general line, and they made them work. And then once after verse 14, after giving the details. Yesterday, when we gave the two versions as to what the word befarach means, it was talking about the end of verse 13. So we have 2 ways of understanding it.
That was the slow tongue version.
That's right. But yesterday, one of the opinions said that befarach also over there means difficult work. Means
Because he talked about verse 14. Then.
no, he was also talking about verse 13.
Oh.
They were both talking about verse 13. That's my point. They were both discussing verse 13, and they were discussing what does the word befarach in verse 13 mean? Does it mean hard labor? Does it mean forcibly, or does it mean soft tongue? So I'm suggesting they're not arguing about what happened. They both agree there was a progression. Right? But they're arguing as to what the verse means, which means like this. So if you say that the word befarach means strong-armed, right? So read like this. The Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people, strong-arming them. And then that would be verse 13. And then verse 14 would describe the process by which they finally got to the strong-arming them. And thus 14 again concludes befarach.
Because they made them work with the straw, which was even harder.
That comes later. Let's not confuse the timeline here. We're talking about way before the straw issue. This is before Moses comes on the scene.
It sounds like what you're saying is that in verse 14 is the slow tongue.
Verse 14 is definitely the slow tone. The question is, what does verse 13 mean?
No, you're saying it already has the strong arm.
Right.
So
But let's do this again. Verse 13 doesn't describe any details. It just says the Egyptians enslaved the Jews. And then it concludes that this enslavement was befarach. Verse 13. Verse 14 describes very specific works. Difficult work, which we explained to mean psychological warfare, working in bricks and mortar, and then working in the field. And then that's 14. So 13 doesn't give any details. It just says, made them work, befarach. Verse 14, details, and also concludes befarach. Okay, good. Now, the second verse 14, which concludes with the word befarach after giving detailed work, there it could not mean soft tongue. Why can't it mean soft tongue? Because it already described all the difficulty. In fact, it started off with the word vayamaru, and they embittered them. So at this point, at the end of 14, they're certainly being strong-armed.
But I thought slow tongue meant a gradual into the work.
Hold on a second. Let's not confuse.
because
So
the
don't stop. We have to go one by one, otherwise we're gonna be confused here.
You know, they started.
So one second. Let's remember what the verses are. We're talking now verse 14. Verse 14 described a gradual decline into hard work. 1 second. After the gradual decline, it uses the word befarach. So what does the word befarach here mean? Strong armed, because we just finished describing how you made it to the point of strong arming them. Not following?
It's their
No,
intention.
because in looking at it as, it's at the end of the verse, it already described that slow process.
That verse.
They're concluding.
That's right. And that it includes that must have been back-breaking labor. Because the soft talk would have been earlier, not now.
But doesn't it include soft talk?
It already, because the verse 14 starts off with, and they embittered their lives. So their lives are already bitter now. But here's the process of their bitterness, gradual bitterness. So now at this point, it cannot mean soft tongue because it's too late. But more importantly,
where did the taskmasters come
okay,
from?
take a chumash there. Sorry,
Where did the taskmasters come from?
we described them earlier. They were the ones employing this whole process. Let's open up to Exodus chapter 1. Okay, there's a problem with that chumash because it's gives commentary already. But just look at the black words. Don't look at the rest of them, because it gives you Rashi's interpretation, not the literal interpretation. But let's just again, verse 13. Okay, how do I get to see this? Is there another chumash there?
No,
Another shemais. Does that see a chumash there?
well, if there's another chumash here.
There's two brown books on the right side of the big shelf.
This one here?
What verse? Verse 1?
No, to the right of that.
This?
Yeah, what is this? To the right. That's the left.
Verse 13?
You're looking to the left.
I have the bold.
Okay, look at the bold. What does it say?
13?
Yeah.
The Egyptians enslaved the Israelites with back-breaking labor.
Okay, so the word back-breaking labor in Hebrew is befarach.
Oh.
So whenever you see the word back-breaking labor, just change it for befarach. Okay. So does it give any details as to what they did there?
Seeing that this.
No. The black word, not the interpretation.
Oh, I'm
The
sorry.
direct translation. Does the verse give any details?
I just read you what the black thing was.
So there's no details.
No details.
No details. They enslaved them, befarach.
Back-breaking labor, yeah.
With
That's all it says.
the word back-breaking labor means befarach, right?
Oh, okay.
Back-breaking labor is Rashi's translation for the word
You
befarach.
included the progression. That's
What?
why.
But that's verse 13 because you're mixing up verse 13 and 14.
Okay,
That's verse 13.
Sorry.
Now read verse 14 in the Hebrew.
In Hebrew?
In the English, just the translation,
They
direct translation.
embittered their lives with
Oh,
hard
their
labor,
lives are bitter now already. How so?
but with mortar and bricks. as
1 second before that, there's a word before that. They bittered their lives with
I said, didn't I say hard labor?
hard labor. So hard labor, we just said, meant psychological warfare, stage 1.
That's-
But their lives are already bitter. That's what the verse started out. And they embittered their lives with what? Hard labor, that's psychological warfare. Number 2.
Mortar and bricks.
Number 2. And
As well as all kinds of work in the field.
3. And then he goes on to say again,
All the work they subjected them to was with crushing harshness.
that's befarach again.
Okay.
Okay. So befarach at the end of 14 and the befarach at the end of 13. Befarach at the end of 14, where it's after describing their embittered lives. At this point, you cannot say it means soft talking. Soft talking is over. Their lives are already bittered. And that's what the Gemara says. But when they're discussing as to whether it means soft or strong, it's at the end of 13. At the end of verse 13, where it does not give details as to what their work was. It just says they made them work. At that point, it could be soft talk. You following?
At the end of
The soft talking cannot be at the end of the process.
No.
The whole point is the beginning. So 14 describes the end of the process. So at the end of 14, you cannot be talking about soft talk. It's too late already. Their lives are embittered.
That's right.
The only question is in verse 13, where it hadn't yet described how they were working and it hadn't yet described that it was bitter. What does that verse mean? Does it mean difficult, strong arm, or does it mean soft talk? There's a discussion we had yesterday at the end of verse 13.
Well, it does say at the end of 13, backbreaking.
That's Rashi's translation. That's Rashi's translation. And that's the translation of the word befarach. Let's not confuse Rashi's translation with the Gemara's translating.
Okay.
So the word backbreaking labor, there's Rashi's translation, and it means befarach. But that's the Hebrew word befarach. The Gemara is asking here, what does the word befarach mean? Two translations,
Okay.
strong arming them or soft talk. So this question of strong arming and soft talking can only be a question of at the end of verse 13. which is the, exactly.
Because you, like you said, there's no description. That's a Rashi description.
Exactly. So chapter,
Because
verse
there's no-
14.
Like you said, there's no specifics as to what the work was.
Exactly.
Okay. Anyone else?
Exactly. So now we're clear. So in chapter 13 was yesterday's discussion what the word.
Very
Yeah.
good.
In chapter 13 was a discussion in verse 13, I'm sorry, there was a discussion yesterday what the word befarach means. Doesn't mean strong arm or doesn't mean soft talking, because that would be for any difficulty. But in 14, where difficulties are described in 3 stages, but because difficulties are already described, now when the verse says the word befarach, it cannot mean soft talk because those days are over. It means strong arm. Now I'm suggesting like this. If we follow the opinion that at the end of verse 13, and it says befarach, it means strong arm, it doesn't mean soft talking. Does that mean right from the beginning it was strong arm? Or, right, that's 13 comes before verse 14. And 14 describes these very difficult things that they did. But 13 says they made them work befarach without saying what the word befarach means. So,
It wasn't strong arms.
one second. Before you answer the question, let's maybe explain the question clearly.
Who's the teacher here?
Hold on a second. In verse, it's going to make this clear because otherwise we're going to be confused here. There was an opinion yesterday that said that the word befarach, even in verse 13, means strong armed. That's what it says. Now, does that mean that strong arming started at the beginning? Or does it mean the verse is describing where it's going to end up? Because it's a generalistic line, without any details, it could be talking about the first day of right away strong arm. That's one way of reading that opinion from yesterday. That right away in verse 13, strong arm. And then verse 14 describes 3 different stages of strong arm. Or verse 13 is saying it's going to end up being strong armed. Now here in 14, we're going to get to the details of how we got to that strong arm. And that's what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting the second reading. And that way, the 2 opinions aren't arguing about what happened. They're just arguing about the translation of the verse. Follow what I'm suggesting?
You're saying 13 can also be a dispute between.
13 definitely is a dispute. The Gemara said yesterday is a dispute what the word befarach means in verse 13. But I'm asking, even if the translation is disputed, doesn't mean the actual events on the ground are disputed. Right? The translation could be disputed even if the events in the ground are the same. Follow what I'm saying? Because the verse 13, even if you translate it to mean strong-armed, it doesn't mean we're strong-armed from the beginning. It could be the verse is saying that we're going to end up in strong-arm, and then the next verse 14 describes the details of how we got to that conclusion of strong-arm, but not that it started off with strong-arm. Follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, for 13.
For 13. So I'm suggesting that even in the opinion which said that verse 13 meant strong-arm, it doesn't mean it started with strong-arm. The verse is describing where we're going to end up. And then the next verse, 14, describes the details of how they got there. This is my suggested reading. I could be wrong. It could be when the Gemara argues. It could be when the Gemara is arguing as to what the word in verse 13 difficulty means. It could be they're actually arguing on the facts in the ground. Straight to strong arm. One opinion. Opinion 2, slow progression. That could be. Or they both agree it started off slow progression and it concluded with strong arm. They're just arguing as to what the verse 13 is describing. Is the verse 13 describing a stage before verse 14? Or is the verse 13 describing the conclusion of 14? And then 14 is the progression of how we got there. Understand what I'm saying? Those are my 2 ways. So I agree with you, Alan. That's what I think. The Gemara is not arguing about the events in the ground. It's just arguing on the translation of the word. That's my suggestion.
And I see it the same way. I see it that it's the intent of the conclusion.
That's what I think it means.
That's
Yes.
what I see.
I can see someone understanding the Gemara the other way. I'm just suggesting that this is probably correct. My reading, I think so.
They definitely reasoned at the very beginning that the Jews were multiplying and multiplying,
Mhm.
and they were afraid of a war and
Yeah.
this and that, and they were afraid to be overtaken.
Yeah.
And let's persuade them to help us.
That's right. That's why I think you're right. This is what's compelling to do this reading, because all the comments we've had so far in the Gemara was all about the slow psychological game that Pharaoh built to get there. And then all of a sudden you're going to tell me there's one opinion that says, no, throw the whole thing out and went straight to strong arming them. There would have been resistance, and all the commentaries that we just gave would have been thrown out. So to avoid that, I'm suggesting that the Gemara is not arguing on the reality of what happened. It's just a question of how you translate that verse. But then the question becomes, well, why are you arguing? If the end conclusion of the progression is the same, why are you arguing over the translation? Right? So maybe it comes back again to context versus literal. The literal meaning of befarach means backbreaking labor, as we see from Rashi. So therefore, in the literal meaning, it would be better to say that both times when it says befarach, it means the same thing. Both times mean backbreaking labor. Just the first time is describing a conclusion that's going to come at the end. So in the literal meaning, befarach is better to translate as difficulty, as strong arming. But in the context, it might be better to say that the first befarach means soft tongue, because that way the verse isn't repeating itself. Follow? Because if the verse 13 at the end means strong-armed, and the end of 14 means strong-armed, and 13 is just describing what's about to be described in 14, then the verse is repetitive. First without detail, and then with detail. But you're saying the same thing. Understand? If verse 13 also means strong-armed, but it doesn't give any details. They made them work by strong-armed then. And then 14 means progression, right? So 14 is just a repetition of 13, but 13 is in general, and 14 is in detailed. So in context, it would be better if the first time it said before, actually it's a different translation. It means soft talk. And now we have a progression. Verse 13 describes soft talk, and then 14 describes the progression into difficulty. But the problem with that one is that the two beforach have different translations. The first beforach means soft talk, and the second beforach means backbreaking labor. So in the literal translation, it's better to say that they're both the same translation. But in the context, it's better to say there's two different translations. Follow? That's what I'm suggesting. And this would keep in theme with what we're talking about here of context versus literal, even though it's not Rabbi Shmuel talking here.
If they would have put them into forced labor at the very, very onset,
Yeah.
they would have a revolution on their
100%. That's what the Gemara suggests. Okay, before I want to conclude though with the comment Rabbi Gimple sent me. I should have said it at the beginning. Okay, yesterday we discussed a dispute as to the cities that they were built. The cities that the Jews built were called Pitom and Ramses. The Gemara insisted, both Rabbi and Shmuel insisted, that it's one city. But the question is, which one's the primary name and which one's the secondary name? And we were asking, why not just say that simply two cities? Why are we compelled to say, why are we compelled to, sorry?
You said yesterday one was the name and one was the description.
Yes.
So they inverted them.
Yes. And my question, so we explained why the context and literal, we explained all that. But my question remained yesterday, which is, why at all say that there's one city? Why not just say it's two? Why not just say it's two? Why say one? And then have this discussion as to which of the two names is the primary name and which one's the description. Why not just say it's two different cities, Pitom and Ramses? Yeah. So Rabbi Gimple suggests three commentaries. He's quoting from three different commentaries. And I'll tell you in a minute why all of these don't satisfy me. So the first answer comes from the Eitz Yosef, which is that they had it by tradition that there's only one city. So my problem with this explanation is, okay, if you have it by tradition, then like,
what does that mean? I don't even know.
Meaning we have a tradition going back to Moses, there's only one city. Just like we have traditions.
Plural?
That's my problem. The verse says they built the cities of Pitom and Ramses.
Right.
So
that's the literal. Right.
That's right. That's the literal meaning. So why is Rabbi Shmuel switching it to one city if the literal meaning is plural? So he's saying that they had a tradition from their teacher, past their teacher back to Moses, that it was actually one city. My problem with that is, look, if you have a tradition, then I'm throwing my hands up and we can't discuss. Number one. Number two, like the Gemara would say, Hagufa kasha. This itself is a question. Why is the tradition that there's one city? why would there be a tradition that there's one city and the verse imply more than one city?
Right.
That itself seems to be, so that's my question that's my issue as it were with that answer. Answer number two is from the Iyu and Yaakov, which is, why mention the names of cities at all? Especially since Pitom is not mentioned anywhere elsewhere in scripture. Ramses is mentioned earlier in Genesis. So this commentary is suggesting that from the very fact that the Torah gives names means it's being open for interpretation, because the Torah shouldn't give names. Sorry.
Since it's cities.
So let's put that on the shelf for a second, and somehow we avoid that, because either way that's going to be a question.
The Torah shouldn't give names.
That's my question.
What does that mean?
The Torah does give names to other cities. It's not like it's an anomaly that Torah is giving names to cities. Torah identifies cities all the time. We have lists in Torah. We're talking about this was a king in that place, and this guy was a king in that place.
Right.
We have all kinds of lists like that. If to say it's so unusual that Torah gives names on a simple reading of the verse, I'm not so convinced. Now, if you're telling me that there's extra, that the Torah gives names so that you can, to allow you to give exegesis, to allow you to learn things. You can learn things out of the verse even if they weren't extra.
Right.
Every verse allows you to do exegesis, which is fine. You're allowed to do exegesis. You're allowed to do drush. It's not a problem. It's always drush. But we're still stuck with why the verse says cities plural. And then finally, the Marsha says a similar thing, that Ramses is mentioned before, Pitom was never mentioned before, which is why they're giving this interpretation. The problem with the Marsha is that only works for the opinion which says that Ramses is the name, because there's a city earlier mentioned Ramses, and Pitom is a description. But we have another opinion which says that Pitom is the name, and Ramses is the description. And the word Pitom doesn't come anywhere else in the Torah, so you put yourself in a bind either way. So I appreciate obviously hearing these commentaries, but none of them really satisfy me properly. And what's the proof that my questions are legit? Because Rashi and Chumash does not quote either of these interpretations. Rashi leaves it on a simple level that Pitom and Ramses were two cities. Rashi in his commentary on Chumash, because that is the simplest reading, right? It's the simplest reading, which means that this whole discussion of Rav and Shmuel about whether it's one city or whether that it was one city and one is whether it's called Pitom and Ramses is a description or it's called Ramses and Pitom is a description is not a question of literal interpretation of the verse. It cannot be. So it's all a message being shared. We should not be. I don't think it should be taken as the literal meaning of the verse, because Rashi describes the literal meaning of the verse to be two cities, right? But we still beg the question as to, it makes the questions a little bit easier, because we still have the question of why you're compelled to say one city when the verses say two cities. Yeah. But what we could say is, Rav and Shmuel agreed that in reality, it was two cities. Right? In reality, it was two cities. But the Torah is teaching us something about these cities, and therefore encoding in here a message, but not that these messages are the literal meaning of the verse. I mean, it still doesn't fully satisfy me, but this is the best I have, I think.
One city inside another?
That's a good answer, but that's not what the Gemara, there's nowhere that says that. That's kind of what Robert's saying. So maybe, but we don't have anywhere that would say that. You have to you're adding something that doesn't say, but maybe. What were you going to say, Mayor?
I was going to ask, why do we have, what's leading us to believe that there would be one city?
That's my question.
But why is it a discussion?
Okay, the Gemara said so, because Rav and Shmuel have a discussion yesterday about whether they both agree it's one city, but the question is which one's the real name and which one's the descriptive name. And that's my question, is why are we compelled to say? So we have to say that this is not a literal discussion. It's a question of encoded messages. And once you're getting into encoded messages, drush, okay, so they're encoded messages, even if the literal meaning remains those two cities. That's the best I can offer.
The Gemara says cities.
The verse says cities, array.
That's right.
Right? And the Gemara doesn't address that even. The Gemara doesn't even address, well, why does it say array? Why does it say plural? The Gemara doesn't even address that.
Pitom is never mentioned in.
That's what it seems, yeah. Never mentioned. Anyway, I think that the answer that Rabbi gave me is only after you accept what I said. That the Gemara is not discussing literal meaning. It's only discussing deeper encoded messages. Now, why they're encoded messages? Because we have a tradition that there's an encoded message, okay. or because the name Ramses only comes up somewhere else. But the context of the Gemara almost seems like it's literal. That's why I'm difficult. It's not so.
That's
it's bothering me, because I'll tell you why. What's bothering me? Because no, I don't know. You don't leave this alone. I think this is the best I can come with.
The primary for your understanding is that we have to understand that it's not that the verse is taken literally, and if you want
the verse is literal.
Yeah, the verse
remains literal. But then if you want to add encoded messages, okay, so you have encoded messages.
Yeah. And you can always encode.
Exactly. And that's where I think this context, this Gemara comes up, although it doesn't fully satisfy, because it does, for some reason, something about the comment between Rav and Shmuel seems like it is a discussion of literal, especially since the other discussions of Rav and Shmuel about whether it was a new king or a king made as if he was new, those are a question of literal interpretation, right? The other discussions between Rav and Shmuel about context versus literal are actually talking about the literal meaning of the verse. So it seems to me that Rav and Shmuel are arguing about the literal meaning of the verse, which brings back my question. Meaning I'm undermining my own answer.
Going back,
but I don't know. I don't have any better.
Pitom was an ancient city in Egypt.
Right. We know that because the verse here says it, but this is the only verse that makes mention of that city.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you going to say?
Going back to what you said a couple of years ago about standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
What would someone of today, let's say of the reggae, would have?
I don't. So I'm. The floor is open. If someone knows a commentary from any of the more recent commentaries that have something on this, I'd be happy to hear. Happy to listen. I make this clear. Just because I leave with a question, the Gemara is still the Gemara, and we learn the Gemara because it's God's Torah.
Right.
It's not a failing on the Gemara's part because I'm too silly to
No, no,
understand.
I understand
It's a failing
that,
on
but
my
I'm just
end
saying,
that
like,
I am incapable of understanding the Gemara's depth.
right.
That's what's happening here. That's what all questions in Gemara are. It's not a question of the Gemara being right or wrong. It's a question of
No.
our capacity to be able to understand it. And that's
Right, exactly.
it's a failing on my end to not know the depth of Rav and Shmuel. That's what's happening
No
here.
question anymore.
Yeah.
Since
Okay.
here,
Yeah.
Ethan and Ramses were two treasure cities, apparently near to one another.
Yeah, this is what we're learning here.
They also like close to the line of Goshen.
Yeah.
They were-
So that's what I was also thinking. And maybe one of the reasons why the Gemara is compelled to say that it's one city is because the Jews all lived in one neighborhood. And something about them being split up to go all other places is strange. They would seemingly herd them all to go build in one place. So maybe that's what's compelling them to say it's one city. And then if it's one city, but it's one city that's kind of like two cities, maybe. But that means we're adding a whole layer of script that's not written.
Don't forget, 3 million people, at least 3 million Jews. They make living in, they make a city by
Yeah.
itself.
Actually, Rashi says that Pitam Ramses already existed before the Jews worked there. But the Jews came to fix it up. That's actually what Rashi says. We looked it up yesterday, right? That there was cities existed, but they went to go fix them up.
There's more than 3 million people.
More. Anyway, we're going to learn tomorrow God willing, about the greatness of Jewish women and what they went through, what they did in Egypt. It's going to be a very fascinating story. Very, very fascinating story. Tomorrow, God willing. Okay, have a wonderful day, buddy.